It's a great honor to be here, to be back in Indonesia, a place where I worked for almost 7 years. I worked in the jungles of Borneo, Kalimantan Timur, and this is one of my favorite places, and it's always so wonderful to come back home. But today, for the next 25 minutes, I am honored to share the stage right now with Dr. Rina Agustina, and we're going to be talking about this landmark Eat Lancet report and walking you through what it is. After that, we're going to have a short panel discussion, putting these global targets into the local context. What does this mean for Indonesia and the region? Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the problem because we know what the problem is. But still, we have these rising rates of, if you're looking at NCDs, obesity, environmental problems, what we're calling a hockey stick. They're going up and up and up, faster and faster and faster. Almost across the board, no matter what environmental variable you look at, we see the same pattern. What we need to do is we need to start bending the curves. We cannot continue on the same approach, the same upward approach like this, where we have increasing consumption, increasing rates of obesity, increasing rates of environmental degradation. We have to start bending the curves, but we're not doing it yet. We know what the scale of the challenge is. Almost half the global population is malnourished. Either too much food or they've got too little food. We have to change this, and we have to do it quickly if we want to have any chance of meeting the SDG goals of 2030, Agenda 2030. However, it's also time now to stop talking about the problem. We know what the problem is. It's now time to start turning this into action. So let's talk about the action and what it is. The goal of the Eat Lancet Commission is how are we going to achieve planetary health diets for nearly 10 billion people by 2050. We're going to put another 2.3, 2.4 billion people on this planet. How are we going to do it for everybody? So, what approach did we use? This was an incredibly difficult task. We took on a huge task. It was going to take us 18 months. It ended up taking us nearly 3 years to complete this. First thing we did is we had to set the scientific targets for what a healthy diet was. What is the science saying about what we should be putting into our body? And we had to bring consensus to that. So we used the latest science to develop these global scientific targets. That was over here. But when we defined the scientific targets for healthy diets, we only looked at human health. What do we need to optimize our health? We did not think about the environment. The second step was how much pressure can we put on the global ecosystems? How much land can we use? How much biodiversity can we lose? How much greenhouse gas emissions can we actually emit from the food that we put into our mouths? We defined limits for the pressure that we could put on our planet. That was the second part, these two global scientific targets, healthy diets and environmental pressure. Then we brought those two together and we said, is it possible to feed these optimized diets for 10 billion people and do it within the environmental limits? And lo and behold, we found out it actually is possible. And we'll show you that in the end. And lastly, we outlined how do we actually do this? What are the high-level strategies that we need to do to make this happen? So, Without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Rina Agustina, who's going to talk about the scientific targets for healthy diets.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. His Excellency, the Norway Ambassador, the Ministry of Representative of Minister of Health, and also the Minister of the PPN and Kepala Bappenas RI. First of all, I would like to thanks to the audience, and also I feel honored to be part of the 8th Lancet Commission. And I would like to apologize that I would present the report in English. So as mentioned by Brent previously, the Lancet Commission the 8th Lancet Commission consists of 37 different experts from 16 different countries, set scientific targets for healthy diets from sustainable food production. These scientific targets, was derived from a vast amount of the available evidence, the best evidence that we can get, and coming from different sources to define the healthy diets. The amount of sources coming from randomized trial of the feeding study, and also the long-term follow-up of hundreds, thousands of people, and also from few randomized trial on dietary patterns. Slide, please. Here the Commission set a reference diet. I think this reference diet is quite important, and where the reference diet coming from the best available evidence. If you look at the first round on the grain, the whole grain, and also the fruit and vegetables, all of these are actually not so much different from what has been recognized on our dietary guidelines and also from the dietary recommendation. So from the whole grains, and fruit and vegetables. The Commission put more efforts in putting more focus on the protein source, the major protein source coming from plants and also animal source products. So here we look at that on this reference, from this showing that quite a modest amount of red meat and about 14 grams a day. So we intake that for a week, so it's about once a week, and a quite modest of the also poultry and eggs, and twice a week of the fish. As you know that quite beneficial effect of fish is also seen from many different studies. So from this list, we see that actually the planetary healthy diets are actually a bit different maybe for the Western country, where we look at the diet for red meat, but not so much different from our diets, Indonesian diet, maybe China diet, Indians, Mexico, perhaps also some African countries, where we eat red meats occasionally, and part of the traditional one, which actually part also consumed not in a daily basis. This recommendation is not radical, but this recommendation is the first time that actually calculated the environmental factors. And this is very important because will change the world. And what does it mean by 14 grams of the red meat? It will not be so much of the problems, because it will actually combine together with the other animal source product, which actually meeting the requirement that we actually expected for the health benefits. But we will look at here later, we'll inform about the promotion of the plant source protein, which will be very much coming from the nuts and also legumes. It has to be promoted in our dietary guidelines. So we want to focus on the healthy unsaturated fat, and also limit amount of the sugar. So the Lancet Commission, and later slide please, picture out. This is actually the conceptual kind of the figures with actually representing the planetary healthy diet. And this planetary healthy diet represent for a week of the average of consumption. And if you look at here, actually, in terms of the description in the plates recommendation, the left side is actually about the volumes. The most volumes of those are coming from fruit and vegetables. So the half of the plates are actually very important to put fruit and vegetables into the diets. And this is actually not so much of different from what has been actually informed earlier and also presented in the balanced diet of Indonesian, for example. The right side is actually we divided all sources that actually contribute to the calories. So the one in volume on fruit and vegetables not so much contributing to calorie, but the right one is actually division of the content of the calorie. If we look at here, actually the vision on all the colors, some of the whole grain, and we also look at the modest amount of the red meat, fish, chicken, and so on. And we put twice of the recommendation for the plant source protein. And of course, limitation of the added sugar as well as the choose of the unsaturated fatty acid, limit amount of saturated fatty acid. And this actually, why we choose the protein is actually very much on the consideration, because this protein major source, the one which actually will influence the health and also the environment. One of our Lancet commission tried to make pictures of how actually in their diets. Of course, we will have to map also to Indonesian diets. And if you look at here, the essence is actually the variety of food. So the variety of food, their healthy diet have optimal calorie intake and consists of largely of diversity of the plant-based foods and low amount of animal source food, certain contain unsaturated, limited amount of the unsaturated fatty acid, and also limited amount of refined grain, and also limited amount of processed food and added sugar. Although the planetary healthy diet seems to be giving the basis of the health consideration, it is also consistent to many traditional diets. It does not imply the global population that they should eat exactly like this or should eat fixed diet, because it has a range on the reference range of the grams, which actually accommodate a lot of people to also choose type of diet that they actually want to put into their daily consumption. Whether they want to be vegetarian or they want to be flexitarians or they want to be omnivora population diet. So therefore, the local interpretation and regional interpretation of this reference need to be adapted, and this universally applicable planetary health diet should be adaptable to the context of region, and is necessary should also reflect the culture, geographical, demographical, and also population and individual. Next. So this is actually some of the examples how the variety of food from the planetary healthy diet. This is a flexitarian diet, which are largely plant-based food, but can optionally include also the modest amount of fish, meat, and dairy foods. We can, of course, do a lot in Indonesia, and I think Indonesia will be the leading of this particular diet, because this is actually part of our traditional diet. And currently, the primary issue is that to create really a palatable food, flavor, variety, enjoyable, affordable, and also nutritional diet. And we also assess and look at how actually the vitamin and minerals actually derive from this planetary healthy diet. It's absolutely showing that quite adequately, very good in terms of fatty acid, vitamin, and also mineral. we also make an assessment of different type of diet around the world against the reference diet that we are building up. And there's a quite huge diet gaps between current dietary pattern and intake of food in a planetary healthy diet. Vertical line of showing 100% of the line there, actually the one which actually stick to the reference diet. If we can see here, the top, the most of the country all over the world. Okay. So on the top of that is actually representing the entire of the red meat. So the country all over the world is way over the red meat, which actually will give implication later, not only to the health but the environment. But not every country have the same profile, same trajectory. There's also some country with incredibly variety around the world. We know that the Mediterranean diet is actually one of the diet of the most healthiest diet in the world, which actually quite having a very important basic of the evidence. And some country is also far from the level of already some, and also some are quite below. Like for example, Southeast Asia region here is representing by South Asia is quite low. Almost all countries, surprisingly, low in fish, low in vegetables, low in legumes, and also whole grains and nuts. So this reference and also these figures also shows is about the proportion. This is actually seeing the proportion of the bad picture of the diet all over the world. It's a bad pictures which actually will invite the opportunities. So all these become a challenge, but also will create an opportunity to improve the healthy and well-being. So this is one of the example of the dietary pattern of South Asia, which is actually all these are low in terms of many types of the food groups, but it's quite high in the starch vegetables. How actually Indonesia should put into this modeling? Actually, the data should be enlarged later. It should be emphasized the need to have long-term study in Indonesia, especially on how actually the randomized trial dietary pattern can be done from many different cultures in Indonesia. This is going to be my last slide, and later I will invite again my colleagues, Brent. In this last slide, I would like to emphasize that the Commission is also analyzing what we call it is the modeling analysis. And the modeling analysis use different approach and see how actually this planetary healthy diet would in fact reduce the premature death all over the world. Because that's actually our main focus and our main interest on the aspect of health. So what we look at here from three different modeling, from the risk and also global burden disease, and also from the empirical disease risk data, showing on this modeling, all surprisingly and interestingly comes into the reduction of about 11 million all deaths per year, which is about 19-20%. So in fact, if we actually following this planetary diet, we would achieve this 20% of reduction, which actually will come along with the goal of the sustainable development goal. And of course, we would like to see how actually then the target, the basis target of the environment. So I would like to let my friend Brent to present the rest of the slides, and also later be providing conclusion, also how actually the way forward to this particular planetary diet. I'd like to thank to the EAT, to the Minister of Health, and also all the audience. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, now that was a health, and Dr. Rina, Agustina did a wonderful job of presenting what are the scientific targets for health. But now let's switch and let's talk about the environment. If we're going to produce food for 10 billion people, what can the environment actually handle? So what we did is we looked at these 6 systems. That is, when we produce food, how much greenhouse gas emissions can we emit? How much land can we clear? How much fresh water can we use? How much nitrogen and also phosphorus can we put into the waterways? And how much biodiversity can we lose from this? There are certain limits to what the earth can handle. You know, and before we used to think that we could do whatever we wanted to, and we're realizing that the earth is absolutely placing limits on us. So if you look over to the right-hand side, you'll see the boundaries. These are the global targets for the amount of impact that we can have for each one of these systems. What we're saying is if we're going to produce food, we have to stay within each one of these boundaries. So what we did is we looked at 3 things. You know, the big question is, how do we feed everybody on this planet? And this is an equity issue. It's not just how do we feed people in certain parts of the world, it's how do we feed people in every single corner. Every single person has a right to a healthy diet. So we looked at 3 things. Number 1 is changing our diets. How do we change our diets, and what impact will that have? Number 2, we looked at if we reduce the food loss and waste, what impact will that have? And number 3, if we change the way that we actually produce the food, what impact will that have? We did not look at crazy technologies that we could put in and might save the world. No, we looked at things that we could do today that we could implement tomorrow that could make a change. So these are the 3 things that we looked at. Now, this looks like a bit of a complicated table. But what we did is we ran a series of models. So we looked at if we combine and say, we change our diets, reduce food loss and waste, change the way that we produce the food, are we above or below the boundaries that we set? So the red up here means that we are above the boundaries. The yellow means that we're within the danger zone. We're pretty close to the boundary, but still okay. The green means we're all right. So if you look up at the very top row, it says baseline, or it says BAU, which is let's just keep on doing things as we're doing things. We don't reduce food loss and waste, and we don't change our diets. Globally, you can see it's red, red, yellow, red, red, red. We are way above the boundary all the way across. That is if we don't do anything. The only way that we are going to be able to tackle this and feed everybody on the planet, if you go down, all the way down to the very bottom, you can see that we get into green, light green, and yellow. We've made it. That is our goal down there at the very bottom, but the only way that we can do it is if change the way that we produce our food, have the food loss and waste, and change our diets. But the great thing about this is it's actually possible. We can actually do it. But we can't do it by only looking at one thing by itself. Now, what this says is, well, let's look at the impact from each one of these things, okay? Let's look at what dietary shift does, changing food loss and waste, and also changing the way that we make and produce the food. If you look at the red up at the very top, that's where we're going to be in 2050. The dotted line that you see, which says 100%, is the boundary. We must stay within that orange boundary. Inside is where we have to be heading. Outside is within the danger zone. So somehow we need to get from and we're just looking at greenhouse gas emissions here, from the red arc all the way down within the boundary. So how do we do that? Next slide. So this is the impact of if we just change our diets. So Paris Climate Agreement. If every single person changed their diets, we would be able to achieve the Paris climate goals by doing nothing else. Every person on this planet changing diet. Dietary shifts have a huge impact. If we reduce our food loss and waste, it doesn't have that much of an impact. It doesn't get us within the boundary. If we change production practices, or if we have waste right here, it doesn't have much of an impact. If we combine all three, which is the very last wedge, it has a huge impact. It's so far under the 100% line. The take-home message is here, if we do all three at the same time, we can have a huge impact and we can actually achieve the goals. Now this is only for greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the other boundaries and add these on top, you can see they all have different impacts. If you just look at the amount of land that we use, which is the second one, the second wedge over to the right, if you look at that, shifting our diets doesn't really help at all. But changing how we produce our food and the amount that we waste has a huge impact on land use. So each one of them has a different impact. Now if we combine all of these, we can make it. We can do it. We can feed 10 billion people a healthy, sustainable diet and do it within the boundaries that we've set. It is possible. So how do we do it? What are the high-level strategies for achieving this? What are the 5 strategies that we outlined? Well, first is, we need international commitments for a shift of diets. Every single country has to change their dietary patterns, have to adopt the scientific targets that we've set forth if we want to have any chance of staying within the boundaries that we've set and achieving the health goals. Number 2, there has been a focus on producing calories, a lot of food. Yes, we can feed every single person on this planet, but we need to focus from quantity to quality. We can't just feed people food, empty calories. We have to feed people good food. So it's a focus on quality over quantity. Now, if you look at where we are today, this is what we're producing. This is how agriculture has to change by 2050. The yellow is where we're going to be in 2050. The green is where we're going to be if we adopt the diet. So if you look at this, look at cereals. Look at rice production, corn. What we're saying is that by adopting the diet, there is no increase needed in cereal production globally. We don't need to focus on cereals. But what has been happening is everybody's focusing on rice and corn and wheat and these cereal products. What we're saying is that we don't need, that's not where the increase has to come from. Where does the increase need to come from? The other stuff. Increase of vegetables by 75%, fruits by 50%, fish by 50%, legumes by, I think it's nearly 150%. That's where the shift has to come. And the reduction has to be in red meat, right there. A 66% global reduction in how much red meat we produce. This is how we need to change the food production practices. The third strategy is we need to intensify how we produce our food. We can produce food on the land that we have. We don't need any more land, period. But the only way to do it is to do it a lot better than what we're doing it. If you look at this next map, you can see that there's some parts of the world which are green and blue that have extremely high yields. Food production is very high there. Other parts of the world, like Africa, which is red, is not producing up to their yields. It's about 20% of what they could be actually producing. We need to figure out, in places like Europe, how to produce food better, much more sustainably. We need to figure out, in places like Africa, how to increase production of food there. And we need to figure out how to get things like nitrogen and phosphorus from places like Europe and the US into places that need it. We are polluting way too many waterways all over the planet. We're using way too much nitrogen and phosphorus in some places and not enough in others. Take-home message, we can do it. And we don't need any more land to do it. We can do it on the land that we have. Orangutans, I used to work with them. We need strong and coordinated governance. Now this is a tricky thing. How do we govern the land that we have? How do we govern the ocean that we have? This is one of the most challenging tasks that we have moving forward. We need strong leaders to step forward and do this. You know, it's going to take strong leaders and the cooperation of every single nation to actually make this possible. Last strategy is we need to have the food loss and waste. Now, in conclusion, so one of the most important things and one of the most important concluding statements that actually comes out of this is if we do not transform the food system, we will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Climate Agreement. Those will be out of reach. We need to transform it to have any chance of meeting these international commitments. The second conclusion is the only way to do it is for all of us to come on board and do it together. That's the only way. Academics, business leaders, policymakers, we all have to come together to make it happen. Third is, we can save nearly 11 million lives by doing this. 11 million lives globally. And lastly is more of a ethical argument. What type of planet do we want to leave to our children? Do we want to leave a planet which is people are healthier, they live longer, safe waters, safe air? Or do we want to leave a planet where people are dying sooner and the environment is actually degraded and destroyed? So, that is the Eat Lancet report. There's a lot there, isn't there? It's a big, deep report. And I think we have got copies outside, and I encourage each one of you to take one and read it. And if you have any questions, we'd be more than happy to answer.